Hello, everyone. I'm Marie Gaarder. I'm the Executive Director of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, or also known as 3IE. For those of you who are not familiar with 3IE, 3IE works closely with governments, foundations, development institutions, and other partners working in low and middle income countries to address their decision-making needs and their evidence systems. And we support the production, synthesis, and translation and uptake of high-quality development evidence across the globe and across sectors. I'm very happy to welcome you all to this webinar, which is part of our bi-monthly Evidence Dialogues webinar series, focusing on evidence and insights on the effectiveness of approaches to international development. Now, today's topic is special and I would say very close to my heart. This webinar is titled Evidence-Informed Development, starting with the man in the mirror, take 2. It is in fact the sequel to a discussion I had with the same panelists exactly a year ago. In March 2021, evidence leaders from FCDO, MCC, NORAD, USAID, and the World Bank met to discuss how to start with, as it were, the man in the mirror, or in other words, the development institution's own practice and use of evidence. The idea was to learn about the challenges they have faced, the promising approaches they have seen and tried, and steps they suggest taking to improve current practices. The panelists agreed during those March discussions that the world's development institutions collect lots of data, and they fund and carry out a lot of research and evaluations, but they don't use it and learn as much as they should. Between the challenges of quick timelines, rigid systems, cultures that reward approvals and disbursements of overlearning and ultimate results on the ground, development agencies do not always walk the talk of evidence-informed decision-making. At the end of the discussion, the panelists agreed to commit to one step they would try to do in their respective organizations and to meet exactly a year later to continue the conversation and report on what they have learned when trying to promote this agenda. So here we are. Let me introduce you to our wonderful panelists today, and please note that their detailed and very, very impressive bios are in the link provided in the chat by my colleagues. So let me start, and let me start with let me see. The only panelist that was not present last year. I'm not sure. Oh, there she's just coming on board. That was good timing, Charlotte. Excellent. So
sorry, I can't use Zoom on the government computer, so I just had to fiddle around a bit.
Oh, very sorry, but very glad that you found a way around it. So, and you came just when I was going to introduce you, as you're the only new panelist. So Charlotte Watts, probably known to many of you, is the Chief Scientific Advisor at FCDO, or what is the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. I'm very thrilled to have you joining us today, Charlotte. We also have Alison Evans, who is Vice President and Director General of the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank. We are joined by Håvard Mokleiv Nygård, is the Director of Knowledge at NORAD, which is the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. Then we are joined virtually, I would say, or double virtual. Mark Sundberg is the Chief Economist at the MCC, which is the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And he could not join us in person today, but we have recorded his responses. And then we're joined by Stacey Young, who is the Agency Knowledge Management and Organizational Learning Officer at USAID. So very warm welcome to all of you. Before I start the discussion, a quick note that this webinar will be 1 hour and 30 minutes. We added half an hour, to make up for the fact that we had to reschedule. We will discuss 3 topics during the first hour, and then we will have about 30 minutes for Q&A. We have received rather several questions from you since the event was rescheduled. We welcomed everybody registered to send in questions, and so we got some great ones. So we will start with these, and probably won't get to many of the questions today that you might put in the Q&A. Nevertheless, I'd like you very much to send in those Q&As. First of all, because panelists may be able to respond to some online, but also because we are planning to produce a blog after this event, in part also responding to questions that have come in during the event. So please keep your questions and remarks flowing. Also, we encourage you to tweet any questions or points of view that you have on Twitter. Please tag @3IE News while you tweet, and use the hashtag #EvidenceDialogues. All right, so with that, let's go to the first topic of today, which is what is the state of critical thinking, evidence use, and continuous learning in the development institutions you are most familiar with. And let me start with Mark first. As I said, his response was recorded. And here's the question that I specifically put to Mark. MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, is a unique organization in that it has put evidence at the center of decision making. And MCC is in fact famous for requiring that its project's economic rate of return pass a certain rate to be considered for investment. And last year, you, Mark, talked about the importance of evidence, not just from a technical perspective, but also from a perspective of using an iterative and real-time approach to learning and solving problems. You were going to try to incorporate PDIA, which is problem-driven iterative adaptation, into your programs in partnership with the Harvard's Center for National Development. Please tell us more about this experience and what lessons you drew. And with this, I'd request Pradeep to bring up the video of the answer.
Thanks, Marie, and apologies for not being able to join on Friday. I really look forward to this, and we'll catch up to the recording that you make afterwards. First, let me clarify a bit about the evidence that we do use. I know that MCC is well known for its deep commitment to using the economic rate of return, cost-benefit analysis, as a criteria for project selection. But on top of that, there's a much richer evidence base that's quite central to the work that we do, including looking at distributional analysis and incidence, fiscal incidence of interventions we support, evidence on climate change and efforts at adaptation mitigation that are in sort of central to the projects that we work on. The growth dynamics, which presents a narrative, and then thinking through what are the binding constraints to try to prioritize interventions. So I don't want people to get the impression that we just do ERRs and then step away. And of course, there's a lot of controversy and discussion around economic rates of return as well. So let me say a few words about the problem-driven iterative adaptation approach. That's a real mouthful. It's really about facilitated problem solving. But I want to start with a few comments about uncertainty and unknowns. I think the beginning of the PDI process is recognizing that there's a lot that we simply don't know. So I think we all agree that evidence is good, and good evidence is even better. But it's necessary but not sufficient, because there's a lot that we simply don't know. And recognizing that, I think, helps set up the need for problem solving in a way that is dealing with uncertainty or lack of evidence that comes up, sort of piercing the veil, working with counterparts closely. Matt Andrews, who's one of the sort of fathers of this approach, recently wrote a paper that is very, very simple, but I think quite interesting. It's called Getting Real About Unknowns in Complex Policy Work. We all know that there are different degrees of uncertainty that we have to deal with in policies, in programs and projects that agencies support. There are exogenous factors that lead to volatility that how do you deal with that? Shocks that occur that are unanticipated. There's uncertainty areas where you really don't know how to parameterize how people react or behavior. There's complexity. There are multiple root causes. MCC has worked with systems thinking, systems learning to try to get at those non-linearities. But there's a lot that's complex and difficult to really capture. And there's ambiguity. I'm sure 3IE knows about this from systematic reviews, and sometimes the evidence points in different directions. So dealing with those different aspects, I think calls for this approach to problem solving that recognizes you may need to move forward, but then step back as problems manifest, and then work around that to see what other ways to address the problems as they emerge. So that's sort of the notion of the PDIA process as a facilitated engagement with local stakeholders. MCC, a year ago when I spoke about this, it was a hot topic, one that we were trying to shoehorn into a number of programs. But I think COVID and other things led to more restrictive ability to really get on the ground, because it requires close coordination, consultation with counterparts. But in Lesotho, let me say just a few words about the Lesotho experience. In Lesotho, in a health project, we did approach this with a PDIA facilitated process. And some of the characteristics about this, I think, are useful. This is at the design stage, not at implementation. We'll be shifting to an implementation stage a bit later. But the problem in Lesotho was very poor health service delivery at the local level and coordination between national and local levels of health care. The sort of quick solution that people thought of was pushing for greater decentralization, sort of subsidiarity arguments for how that would get to the heart of decision-making at the local level. But what MCC did was first to get a facilitator on the ground who would work with multiple policy offices responsible for this at the national and subnational level. Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Health both engaged in this, and local hired people working for MCC's challenge account, what we call the MCA, were working with this too. And they went down to subnational levels, spoke with officials, spoke with healthcare providers, spoke with communities, and tried to form a deeper understanding of this, and found that by approaching this, the sorts of issues that emerged are not terribly surprising, but there were issues around procurement, around the information management system that was dysfunctional and how that had created problems in working within the national system, delays in disbursements that were critical for contracting, and bottlenecks that emerged. And by that sort of problem solving, the key things we found was there's much greater buy-in. The consultant work and contracting for assistance was done by Lesotho counterparts, not by consultants we hired in Washington. It was really a different process. And you might ask, well, does this slow things down? It may be a slower process. It's less given to putting into Gantt charts. But at the same time, it's getting at solutions that we have greater confidence in, and certainly generates greater buy-in. That's at the design stage. I think the real challenge is at the implementation stage. And we're starting with two other programs, one in the Gambia, another one in Solomon Islands, sort of, smaller engagements that are maybe less prone to generating big problems. But I think this, let me say one last thing. I think this sort of challenges the notion of bringing best practice or using a log frame neat analysis or even a theory of change that is sort of set out in advance that we can then operate through to recognize that these sources of uncertainty really need real-time solutions on the ground. And that's what we hope to do in the implementation phase.
Great, thanks so much to Mark. And it sounds like from what he's saying that we'll have to have a new evidence dialogue next year to hear him report back from the implementation phase. Now, let me turn to you, Charlotte. As Chief Scientific Advisor at FCDO, you have really a key role in ensuring FCDO is an evidence-informed institution. And so based on your experience, what are the processes and incentives required to ensure evidence use and continuous learning within FCDO? And in our conversation, you mentioned a number of measures that are being put in place to further strengthen the evidence culture there. So could you please tell us about some of those?
Yeah, happy to. And it's a real pleasure to be here and to be joining a range of great colleagues, and Alison, really lovely to see you in your new role. I think the first thing is just being very clear about why we care about evidence and the use of evidence. And I think it's really, you cannot not overstate that many times. Of why do we care about evidence? Because it's the way that we're going to deliver impact. It's the way we're going to achieve our objectives. It's the ways we're not going to end up in a situation where, you know, we bring a risk to the credibility of what we do. So I think that why is always really important, just to remind people of. If you think about the how, within FCDO, there are a few ways that we're thinking about that. I think the first is just, how do you make using evidence easy and accessible? And so for us, that there are two components to that. We're increasingly, actually three, there's increasingly a sort of a focus on really priority areas. How do we ensure that we have good syntheses that really boil down what does the evidence tell us, and what are some of the caveats, or what are some of the contextual factors that might influence how you interpret that evidence. But so, for example, I've been working very closely with the chief economist to produce pieces called Best Buys that are condensing often quite large bodies of work into what we hope are digestible areas. I think the second is then making sure those types of evidence syntheses and other types of syntheses are accessible to our sectoral advisors, so the people who are embedded across our department, who are tasked with supporting business case development, who are or play a really important role in advising ministers. And that includes through their L&D activities. And then the third area that we're paying increasing attention to is also how do we ensure, particularly at very senior levels, how do we ensure we can draw on the networks that we have, for example, through our research investments or through our evaluation networks, so that you can also access deep expertise where you need it. And at the moment, we're thinking about, are there ways that we sort of align some of our research investments with also a greater capacity to draw down that technical expertise linked to the sort of major areas where we're investing in research. I think the other area on the how that we're trying to do is just really pay very close attention to, in our research investments, are they aligning to our priority policy needs? And, you know, thinking not only about our research investments as global public goods, which they are and they aim to be, but also to support our own delivery, and much more explicitly thinking about those investments as part of the ways we deliver. So, for example, we've done a lot on education. What's the evidence and synthesis of evidence on what works to deliver education? You know, what's the evidence about how we address the learning crisis following COVID, or how do we prevent violence? And putting, you know, increased effort in how do we make that evidence available, but also how do we get visibility to that evidence, not only for us to use, but for other key stakeholders to use. And then lastly, in terms of new initiatives, along with that sort of increased emphasis on some of the aspects I've just spoken about, we're also thinking about two new areas. One is along with the embedded evaluations that we have along with our programs, also how do we think about having flexible funds at the center that can be used for strategic evaluations? And that might be areas where there might be less of a culture of evaluation, and where if you map, sort of the evidence base, it's areas where we are really interested in what the evidence says, but actually, it's traditionally been an area where there's been a less emphasis on, for example, using trials or rigorous evaluations, for example. And then secondly, to enable us to try and implement evaluations of areas where traditionally, again, there hasn't been evaluation work. So for example, in diplomacy work. So as FCDO, much more emphasis on how do we use our diplomatic levers in combination with our other development programming, for example, to deliver development impacts. But actually, if you look at the evaluation evidence on how do you do a diplomacy really effectively, very limited evidence base. So this sort of central pot and saying, actually, how do we have some parts of our evaluation portfolio that's very deliberate, quite top down, and really trying to fill some critical gaps. And then lastly, just a point on the synthesis. I think we've supported a lot of synthesis over the years. I think we're moving much more to very deliberately bringing in the economic analysis, and also much more deliberately thinking about what do we understand about the effect sizes of interventions. So it's not only does that intervention have an impact or not, but also what is the scale of that impact? Is it transformative or is it marginal? And what's interesting, so for example, if you look at the education evaluation literature, massive differences in the scale of outcomes that you achieve through some interventions versus others. So in a way, we're trying to be a bit more ambitious around, we don't only want to implement interventions that work, we want to try and ensure we're investing in the interventions that give us the biggest effect sizes, give us the biggest return on our investments. I'll end there, but happy to discuss later.
Great, thanks so much. And I know, knowing what some of the other panelists will come in talking about, I think there are lots of threads that I know everybody will pick up on. And of course, just from 3I's perspective, hearing the emphasis, on both using existing evidence, the synthesis part, making it accessible, as well as the costing, which is something so key and very fascinating that you're tackling the diplomacy side of things, and so really look forward to hearing more about that in the future. So let me then move to you, Alison. Based on your role, I mean, previously, as I call it, evaluator in chief for UKAID in your past, and now in the World Bank. So what are your key reflections on the main barriers to good evidence use? And particularly in our conversation leading up to this panel, you said, and I thought it was fascinating, so I increasingly believe the main problem is not the existence of evidence. Knowing what to do with the evidence is the problem. And in last year's panel, you also said that it's quite an art to find those moments where the conversations are happening, where we really want to crowd in some of the evidence that we can provide. And so you said you're going to pilot a few things to see if we can identify the spaces and influence those spaces with the range of evaluation products that we produce. So please tell us about those pilots and more generally what you've learned since last year.
Thank you so much, Marie, and lovely to see everyone, and great to be back again a year later. So the first thing, just maybe picking up a little bit on a couple of threads we've heard from Charlotte and Mark. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the World Bank Group is an incredibly rich evidence environment. I mean, it's a busy evidence environment. It's almost a noisy evidence environment. And I think from the standpoint of independent evaluation, which is my positioning within the institutions, it can be hard to know what the right piece of evidence is at the right time to be most useful to the operational complex and to doing the right thing in the right ways to achieve that kind of impact that Charlotte was referring to. And that only becomes more difficult, I think, in times of heightened uncertainty, where there is, you know, as Mark indicated, much more awareness that we can't always rely on what we already know, and we're tackling a whole series of new unknowns, and the need for evidence to be crowded in quickly becomes ever more urgent. At the same time, of course, even though demand for evidence, you know, is in a way constant in the World Bank Group, there is a certain logic to the pace and scale of the project and programming cycle. And it's important that I think we, particularly in the evaluation side, really understand that and understand that logic to find those spaces, as I said 1 year ago, where we can make evidence available in a form that is going to be most usable. And so I think I sort of frame one of our challenges is how we, if you like, meet the moment when there's a synchronicity between the evidence that we have available and the evidence that is most useful. And we spent a bit of time following the discussion last year thinking about how we could understand better the sort of logic, particularly of the country programming cycle in the World Bank. And some of my colleagues did a certain amount of work there to identify those opportunities for us to make evidence, our evaluation evidence, available in a more timely manner, in a form that made most sense for those who needed it. And I think what we learned is two interesting things. First is that actually quite a lot of what we do in independent evaluation in the World Bank Group feeds what I call the kind of long route to use and learning. And that is a sort of well-established process of us engaging, of us getting maybe a little resistance, of us then getting some acknowledgement and eventually some digestion and eventual action linked to the evidence that we bring to bear. Now, I don't want to underestimate the importance of that long route by any means. It is incredibly valuable. We are able to trace often many years later the influence that these evaluations have actually had on practice across the institutions, but it is a long route. And I think what we're aware of when we go and talk to frontline staff is that they are eager for there to be shorter routes available to them, shorter routes for uptake and learning linked to our evaluation evidence. And I guess they sort of came back to us with 3 areas where they want us to invest more in these short routes to learning and uptake. One, which won't be a surprise to anyone, is the point about, you know, accessible packaging, finding ways to share robust evidence, but in formats that really allow for very quick transfer of insights and lessons. And Marie, you all know that IEG has been on a long journey trying to invest in those kinds of more accessible formats, and we continue to strive in that area. The second actually is a lot more direct access to experts, to evaluation experts. They don't want actually everything to be written down in a report. Sometimes they just want to have the conversation where there can be a dialogue around the accumulated insights that we have around sectors or geographies, or instruments, and they want that to be available through more informal formats. And then thirdly is just the timing, getting better at understanding the timing of key cycles around strategies and strategy development or country programming. So we took all this information and we've since actually generated a new product which we're calling Evaluation Insight Notes, which is a new shorter assessment evaluation product, which is actually a more synthetic product. And it builds and mines a lot of existing data we have and tries to bring that forward to answer questions of the current moment. Now, of course, there are always going to be some limitations there because certainly the context is changing so rapidly now. We can never presume that the past is a great guide to the future, but we're also really taken with just how much useful insight is sort of buried deep often in our much bigger slower and longer route evaluation products that we can bring forward to the attention of our operational colleagues in a much more effective way. I just want to say one last thing before I pass back to you, Marie, which is we've been sort of identifying things we can do, if you like, at the margin to make our evidence more useful in the moment. But I think that at a system level, one of the key things that we're also working with our partners on the World Bank side is to really build up our shared commitment to outcomes as the kind of key instrument for finding moments where we're more in sync about what evidence is needed on what issues at what time. And I think this outcome orientation, as we call it, is a crucial way for us to ensure that we are able to, through evaluation, meet the moment for the kinds of evidence that's going to be most useful for enhancing the development effectiveness of World Bank operations. And it's not only relevant internally, it's relevant for our partners and our client countries too. I'll leave it there.
Wonderful, and thanks so much. I mean, I think you're already seeing a lot of similarities in views and sort of this lesson around making things accessible, understandable, synthesized, practical, etc. is coming through very strongly, among others, in your comments. So this is excellent. Let me now move straight over to you, Håvard. NORAD has sort of traditionally been an institution more focused on supporting development through partnerships, really, wherein the partners are responsible for evidence use and learning, while sort of at the central level, the focus was, has been mainly on managing the partnerships. I'm sure I'm oversimplifying, but I'm taking some freedom here. So you are 1 year into this newly created, very interesting role of knowledge director. And so what have you learned about the evidence culture in NORAD during this year, and how will this inform you, how you go about strengthening the culture of evidence use, critical thinking, and learning in the rest of the organization?
Yes, thank you, Marie, and yeah, thank you for organizing, and so good to see everyone again 1 year later. No, so that's an extremely good question, Marie, and I'll try to tackle it from a couple of different angles. So as you say, we are basically a year into this experiment with a director of knowledge and a division of knowledge, although I am to some extent older than the box on the organizational chart. The division of knowledge only came into being in September of last year, so we have a little bit over half a year now with this new experiment. And it is, I think it's important to emphasize and I really emphasize the fact that I think for NORAD, and probably for most other organizations, our most precious resource and the resource we always have the least of is man and woman power. Money for stuff is always easier to find than time. Staff time basically is our dearest resource. Still, the NORAD leadership, and especially the Director General of NORAD, made this conscious decision to make and build a division of knowledge, meaning that we're taking people, and we didn't get any new hires or lines or anything to build this division. So it's been taken from existing staff, meaning that we're taking people that quote unquote could be working with aid, and instead they're working with knowledge. That was a strong signal from management and from leadership on the importance of knowledge. Obviously, we are very cognizant of that, and trying to make the most out of the resources that we now have. And we also, in addition to the people that came to us from other parts of the organization, we've also been able to tailor some, we have a new analysis section, for instance, where we have some new analytical so people with more cutting, more like what should we say, sharp analytical skills than we had in the organization before. So we are, still to some extent trying to figure out exactly where where we get the most bang for the buck in terms of the knowledge division. But there's two areas for this in particular. The one is, so we are now in the process at NORAD of reorganizing all of our aid into portfolios. So we used to have some of our aid pretty well organized in portfolios, but now we're doing that across the board. So everything is supposed to be organized in portfolios. And we've decided that at the top of all of these portfolios, we are going to have a knowledge and learning plan. That obviously is not something we came up with. That's something that others organizations have tried, and there's been very good experiences. So this is where we really see, the first larger role for the knowledge division is trying to help the rest of the organization with creating these knowledge plans, figuring out, where, how do you put those together? What's your toolkit, basically, right? So also at the top of every portfolio, we're developing theories of change, and I think those are particularly important. And if we get this to work, right, then the theory of change really should give you a whole lot of information on, to put it a bit naively, where you know what you're doing and where you don't know as much of what you're doing. Don't know as much because you're trying something new, you're piloting, you're doing something more risky. And that has to feed in to the knowledge plan, right? So that gives you a lot of information, and it gives you a lot of information on where can you more or less do a standard midterm review like you always done, because you quote unquote know what you're doing, and where do you have to think completely differently about knowledge protection. Where do you need RCTs, where do you need whatever, and to try to have that knowledge discussion, or whatever we want to call it, at a more strategic level is something that we see a lot of value in. So now it's not just up to each individual caseworker, but it's a question of what kind of knowledge does the organization need at the portfolio level, but also at the strategic level, to inform us in a useful and an efficient way. And where do we best use which parts of the knowledge toolkit, from the simplest midterm review to the most extensive strategic evaluation or RCT or more advanced statistical work or whatever. And I think several people have touched on that already, but this issue of what is the right fit evidence is crucial here, because it is evidence, to some extent. Evidence is easy to find, right? There's so much evidence out there, there's so much data out there, but getting it into the processes in a way that works both at a program level, at a caseworker level, but also at a portfolio and a strategic level, that's tricky. It's either, depending on how you see it, it's either hard or it's an interesting challenge. And so far we've decided to call it an interesting challenge, and we'll see if we still think that in a year. But it's I think it's really important. And I think that also connects back to, so Mark talked about the need for real-time solutions on the ground. That's something that we see really coming out of some of these knowledge plans in parts of our portfolios, but not all of them. And I think it was it was Charlotte who talked about this issue of where is what we're doing transformational and where is it's marginal, depending on what kind of evidence you have. There's also, we want to have those discussions at the strategic level so that we know that we can be a bit more sure that we're prioritizing our resources correctly, because it is, again, quite easy to find evidence for whatever intervention being effective, but is it really transformational? How substantive is actually that effect? Those are the kinds of discussions we want to have at that level with the right evidence to make the right prioritizations. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
That's excellent, Håvard. And if you allow me, just because it was one thing that you mentioned to me, and that I thought was fascinating was, and it builds a bit on both this idea that was brought up, from Alison on sort of direct access to evaluation expertise is often is needed, and that sometimes relates to flexible funding, which Charlotte had talked about, and the best of intentions can be destroyed by procurement systems, have been my experience in the past. I just wonder whether you could say any couple of words very briefly on that.
Yes, I could say a lot about procurement, but I'm not going to talk specifically about procurement. But and I guess to some extent I also didn't really answer your question, Maria, because you talked about partners. But I think you're touching upon something really important. That is, as you said in your original question, we work through partners almost exclusively. So we need their knowledge operation to be good, and we need that to work together with our knowledge operation. And in that link, we very often see funding being the stupidest of problems, right? So often we have a partner who has the best project in the world, and they have which they have funding for already, and then they have a beautiful design for how to evaluate it, how to integrate an RCT, or how to do some kind of other impact evaluation or some kind of other work, but they don't have funding for that in their program per se, and then we don't have a centralized pot of money for those kinds of initiatives right now. So basically, to be brutally frank with you, what we're doing now is 100 different ad hoc solutions. That's not a good way. And as we are trying to move also to a place where we have more, we also, because we also want to have a strategic dialogue with our partners about the proper use of evidence and learning, a strategic dialogue where they are, feel empowered and free to talk about what works and what doesn't work, and where we can really have that frank discussion. And in that dialogue, we see a need to have flexible, flexible funding that we can use towards these initiatives when and where they are needed.
Great, thank you, and thanks for allowing that question on the spot at the end. So Stacey, now similarly in a sense to Håvard, you started in a new position as Agency Knowledge Management and Organizational Learning Officer at USAID about a year ago. And so what have you learned about the evidence culture in USAID during this year? And in last year's panel, you mentioned that you were planning to map out the evidence chain in USAID and doing some analysis around the different links in that chain, specifically about what kind of evidence is shared in what ways, and understanding which ways actually are most effective at supporting decision making. So it's a little bit similar also to what Alison was laying out, and in a sense also others. Please could you share us your lessons?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Marie. And thanks to my other co-panelists as well. I always love these conversations that we have around evidence and evidence use, because it's so important to the effectiveness of the work that we're all engaged in. So I'm going to share a few top line messages first, and then I'll go into talking about what we've learned about the types and forms of evidence that are important, and then also the learning contexts that are most useful for staff to take that evidence on. So the top line messages, I don't think will surprise anybody, but they're important. They are that staff value a range of evidence types, and they're more likely to reach for those when they're involved in program planning versus later during implementation, when we should be drawing on evidence to inform adaptations. But later in managing implementation, there's often not a lot of time to pause and reflect on new evidence. So, that's one of the things that we need to continue to grapple with. Another top line learning is that longer term holistic learning approaches are more effective, but they're more time consuming than discrete pieces of evidence. So let me talk a little bit about what we've learned about the types and forms of evidence that staff seek out and value. And I'll give some examples so you have some context for these. So in one joint webinar that we did with the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group, Alison's shop, on lessons that we've learned from the Ebola response to apply to the COVID response. One of the things that we learned there, which resonates with things that we've learned elsewhere, is that that discussion really came alive when people brought stories about the work that they were doing, that resonated more, and it was easier for staff to take on, and it engaged staff in deep conversation more than some of the sort of drier forms of discrete evidence can do. We are in the process of developing an agency policy for knowledge management and organizational learning. And in the course of doing that, we've been conducting consultations with groups of people who are helping us in that process. And what we're finding through those consultations is that staff want relevant evidence. They want it to be in easy to digest formats. They want it to be easy to find, and they want more systems and tools and skilled staff to help with knowledge synthesis and uptake. So again, resonating with what some others have said. We see an increase in evidence availability, such as through our evaluation registry and development data library, which I think speaks a little bit to evidence demand. We see the continued popularity of the collaborating, learning, and adapting case competition. So this is collaborating, learning, and adapting being the way that it's a holistic approach to informing adaptive management in our program cycle processes. And that annual case competition continues to be really popular. So people submit a lot, and they also use a lot. And I think that underscores that program planners and managers want case examples that inform their work. We have a strong and growing emphasis in the agency on localization and on how that fits with diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And that priority is strengthening our culture of learning, specifically with respect to recognizing that we need to do a better job of understanding local knowledge systems and bringing those local knowledge systems together with our more sort of Western scientific method approaches to evidence. And that recognition is really resonating in the agency, and it's strengthening USAID's evidence culture by starting to broaden our understanding of what counts as evidence and whose evidence counts. So that's all around sort of the types and forms of evidence. We're also learning a lot about the learning contexts that staff value. And in what I'm about to share, I think you'll hear a lot of resonance with insights that come from behavioral science. So I want to mention a few examples. There's one program that is now in its third iteration in the agency. It is a team-based long-term learning program, and it originated around policy priority around private sector engagement, and now it's being adapted for climate finance. This is a team-based holistic learning approach that focuses on building the capacity of teams who are working together on particular projects in their countries, building their capacity over time in a really well-rounded way. So helping them understand the technical evidence base in the work that they're doing, but also strengthening their partnership skills and strengthening their ability to navigate power dynamics, both within the agency and in the partnerships that they're trying to build. It's a really holistic approach. It ranges, as I mentioned, from technical knowledge and really grappling with the evidence base all the way to mindfulness and mindset. And there have been 2 reviews of that learning approach, And those learning reviews have yielded evidence that there is significant increase in the competencies that that learning approach aims at. The downside being that it takes a lot of time, and we've all acknowledged that that is, that is a constraint. Another example comes from our second annual Evidence Week, Evidence and Evaluation Week that we had several months ago. That event attracted a lot of staff who wanted to both share what they've learned and learn from others. The context was a combination of evidence sharing from subject matter experts and also peer exchange among participants. And then the format was structured to build in time for reflection so that staff could think about how they would use the evidence. And that built-in time to really internalize and then figure out what to do with the evidence is something that we have also used in the collaborating, learning, and adapting space, and staff really value that. I think that is often the missing link in getting from evidence to action. The staff who engaged in that really appreciated that the evidence was directly relevant to policy priorities because it was part of our agency learning agenda, which focuses on generating, sharing, and applying evidence specifically around agency policy priorities. They also appreciated that it was an opportunity to see their contributions to the evidence base reflected. And this resonates again with behavioral science and with what we've learned previously about how staff are more likely to use evidence if they have a role in shaping it and contributing to it. And then the last thing that I want to mention is work that we're doing in the COVID learning space. So similar to a lot of development organizations, we were slow to initiate evidence efforts around COVID that serve longer term learning versus the near-term response. But we're now in the process of planning the first ever agency-wide big picture reflection to explore USAID's COVID response around second order impacts. And again, we're building on what we've learned about the contexts in which staff like to learn and take on evidence. And so that will be a pause and reflect event that uses that format that is both working with what is the evidence base and working with learning practices that help staff to internalize it and figure out how to apply it in their programs. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wow, this is thank you so much. This is fascinating, and we'll have to, after, as I said, there will be a blog. We'll have to capture all of these amazing lessons and experiences that you've all gathered. Now we're going to go straight into topic 2, and what I will propose is that, and this was also the idea from the start, this is not going to go to the whole panel. I will actually first have Mark and then ask Charlotte to address the second topic. If any of the rest of you would like to talk about it, you can bring it into when you're answering also in the Q&A session that follows. And so the topic number 2 was, where development objectives and other political priorities diverge. What strategies have you found to work to keep policy evidence informed? And so with that, let me just ask Pradeep first to play the video that we recorded with Mark's response.
Thanks for the question. Last year, when you convened this panel, I made a statement that the evidence-driven approach that MCC applies helps to insulate us from political interference. And I really want to underscore that. Our scorecard system for selecting countries means that congressmen can't call up our head of agency and say, I'd really like to see country X get a compact. It has to go through this process. The use of cost-benefit analysis and what are set out as clear investment criteria, mandatory, and then they're elective ones, makes it clear that you don't shoehorn in interests of the power sector or education sector to get at problems or at projects that really don't fit within the overall evidence-based approach we have. So I think that that's one critical area. But you know, there are times when not necessarily politics, but the exigencies of the situation, I think, can trump evidence. At least when evidence is not completed in time, or there's a real need to move faster than we can analytically push, I think that leads to quick decisions based more on impressions than strong evidence base, and there have been a few cases like that. You know, it comes back to a bit around the question of uncertainty also. Management, senior management, and politicians like sort of simple answers. So, you know, this is the rate of return you're going to get. When we know that there's a lot of uncertainty, there's standard deviation around these estimates, but dealing with uncertainty is difficult. So we're pushed to have sort of simple answers to questions based on the evidence, which is often full of much greater, ambiguity. So there are issues of that sort, but in the end, there really is a deep commitment to having this evidence driven. I think that helps to deal with the political pressures that I think any government agency, or for that matter, the multilateral development banks face as well.
Great, thanks, Mark, and straight over to you, Charlotte, for your reflections on the same question.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting question. Just a comment on, it's just interesting the way that you frame it of evidence versus political, because actually the way I think about it in my role, so I'm the chief scientist in a department, so my role is to support good decision making, get expertise, evidence used. And the thing I've learned is actually there's just a range of factors that influence decision making. And so evidence is one component of that analysis, but there will also be other factors, sort of, what is the political lens on this, or there might be about the feasibility of delivery. And so for me, the key thing I'm very concerned on is one, that evidence is featuring into often quite a complex set of decisions about what happens, and that there isn't a conclusion that's using evidence if actually the evidence doesn't support it. Because sometimes, if I just think about COVID, for example, and our responses to COVID, there you had competing types of consideration. What does the epidemiology say? What do the economics suggest of taking actions? In the end, that is a complex elements that need to be weighed up by our political masters. And what in a way, I think what we need to be assured of is that evidence is featuring into that consideration, and it will happen alongside the politics. So I just found the sort of one or the other feels a bit oversimplistic of actually the process of decision making that we're part of, and where evidence we want to play in. And then just the second reflection around evidence for me is actually how useful evidence is to raise difficult issues, to introduce challenge, and so it's a really, really powerful tool if you can. And I think Alison said this, actually insert evidence at the right time, and it's spotting that opportunity, but actually it is a way where you can change the direction of conversations if you've got the right evidence there, and then it's sort of spotting where that is and trying to ensure you've got the right evidence, and actually sometimes able to summarize that evidence in a very succinct way that people can get very quickly, because at times, particularly in very prescient situations or where you have to move at pace, it's getting that right analogy, it's getting that right articulation is the thing that it ends up being influential, and whether it then sort of does feed into influencing a high level decision.
Wonderful. No, thank you so much. This is I think it's the way you sort of and I agree that the question was provocative by design, and you caught that, and I think this issue of evidence being a powerful tool, but not sort of in its in a way that it inserts itself in conversations, I think is an excellent one. Sorry, Alison, did I see you holding up your hand? Okay.
Yeah, it just occurred to me, Murray, thank you, that actually I just wanted to build on that, and I guess I would also agree with Charlotte that it is about how we as evidence generators work effectively within the political economy of our institutional environments, and to sort of imagine we can somehow insulate ourselves from that is in a sense to defeat the object of what we're trying to do. We're trying to guide our evidence, which is about both learning and accountability, into the right places at the right time to the right stakeholders. I think one of the things I'm increasingly aware of is that we have audiences for our evidence who at times are really looking for those kind of corner solutions where it's just this or it's that. And actually, very rarely is it this or it's that. It's actually quite a lot more complex than that. So in a way, one of the things we can do is just to present the range of trade-offs and challenges. And it isn't always about using evidence to decide it is this or that. It's about, can we have a really informed dialogue about the direction of travel? And that is super important, even when the environment is, small p political. I still think that's an incredibly important role that we all play in the evidence game.
Excellent points, and really, fascinating topic, in the sense that if we have the evidence, at least lack of evidence shouldn't be the thing we hide behind. That's the and the rest are sort of things that we sort of moral weights and sort of competing interests, and putting them more squarely in what we're discussing. By taking away the evidence part, we center the discussion. I think partly that's also what we're hearing.
Just to one additional point, if you don't mind, which is also, it's not only do we have the evidence, but what level of confidence do we have in the evidence? So to me, that was a really important part, for example, in discussions around COVID and the COVID response, or some of the syntheses as scientists in government we're trying to do. It's saying this is an area where we think it's this, but it's high uncertainty. Or these are areas where we feel pretty confident on this. So again, I think it's like, do we have the evidence or not? Again, is quite simple, a simple presentation of actually the types of conversations you're trying to have. These are areas we feel really confident there's strong evidence. These are areas where we sort of feel confident, but the evidence actually isn't quite there, it's weak. But based on other situations, we might still fairly confident in it.
Very good point, very well taken. Excellent. So with that, we will move on, and to let you know that, as a first step in 3IE's commitment to contribute to an improved evidence culture, we are crowdsourcing ideas and recommendations on how to improve the incentives and also the culture of critical thinking and so on, and evidence-informed processes in international development institutions. We were planning to show you slides about what we've sort of gathered, crowdsourced so far, but Pradeep and Didi, I don't think we should do this at this point. We've gone over time already, and the discussion is too fascinating. We will have a poll at the end of the Q&A where we can get some of your inputs at that point. But right now, each of you of the panelists will get basically just a minute to share one recommendation that that you would like to make to further strengthen the evidence-informed processes in your own institutions beyond what you mentioned. Is there, like, on your wish list, if you had sort of you're all empowered, etc., is there anything you would want to add? And just very briefly, so we will let's start with Alison. Just going by how you appear.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to restate actually what I said towards the end, which is that, I think we do need to kind of raise our eyes to the system level, and what I mean by that is not the sort of processes and procedures that make up the systems in which we, programming and policy making happens and evidence generation, but more about, the systems that help us orient to what's important, to the impacts we're trying to achieve in the world. And the more that evidence generators and evidence users are on the same page about the orientation of the institutions, what we call in the World Bank Group increasingly outcome orientation, I think this is hugely important for getting us on the same page and for us to be able to generate a stream of evidence that is more likely to be useful at the right time in the right way. So getting to that larger conversation about where are we going? Are we headed in the right direction? Do we know which development outcome areas we're really trying to make a difference to, and then making sure that the evaluation evidence, in my case, comes in behind that to really support that endeavor. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Stacey?
Yeah, thank you. This is a great question. And I'll just say, you know, there's such a firm evidence base for what it takes to actually learn. And we should invest in the things that are required for people to actually learn from the evidence that we have. And what's required is time. We need to take the time to actually understand the evidence, reflect on it, internalize it, plan for how we implement it in the work that we're doing, plan for course corrections that we need to make. We need resources, we need staff and funding to generate evidence, but also to hold the kinds of knowledge exchange and knowledge internalization events and engage in those practices. We need leadership commitment. You know, time, resources, and leadership are the things that always come up in these discussions. And then the last thing is we need that more holistic approach to learning that really helps connect to people's passion for doing better development. You know, it's a huge resource that we don't really talk about. We don't really leverage systematically, but people are in development because they want to make a difference. And that passion and commitment for the mission of our organizations is an enormous resource that we can leverage to support learning and to support continuous improvement. And we know more and more about how to do it. So we need to take that learning on and actually implement it. Thank you.
Great. Håvard?
Yes, thank you. So, you know, I am. What Stacey and Alison said was so smart and insightful that I won't even try to add to that. So I'm gonna instead break the rules just a little bit, if that's okay, Maria, because there's one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately, especially, you know, because we've been grappling with, you know, how do we respond to the Ukraine crisis? What are the you know, the knowledge, the analytical challenges for us in, you know, developing priorities and changing priorities in light of that. And I have this strong sense, and I'm pretty sure it's more than a sense, I think I actually know, that we are definitely in a situation where we probably, you know, NORAD is doing to a very large extent the same thing that CEDA is doing, to the same thing as USAID is doing, and the same thing as the World Bank is doing. I think there's so much duplication of work being done in the knowledge sector, whatever that is. So I think my recommendation, if I'm going to try to frame it as a recommendation, is for, you know, and I know that, you know, there's lots of really good forum for exchanging ideas and best practices, etc., in knowledge and knowledge management. But if we could be a little bit better in coordinating ourselves, in dividing up the work, basically divide and conquer, I think that would be a really good recommendation for donors as a whole. Sorry for breaking the rules, Maria, but
I know, I think it's great. I don't think I broke a rule. That was a very clear recommendation. so great. And Charlotte, you get the last word. And by the way, Didi, and we will not play the Mark's video. I think we'll stop with Charlotte and move to Q&A after that. Charlotte, you get the last words.
Great, thanks. And actually, I really like that last suggestion. I'm sure we're doing a lot of analysis that you similarly are doing. The one I wanted to say is just how do we hardwire in and reward the use of evidence by the kind of hardwiring that we're doing. So, for example, you know, we've now moved our evaluation unit into the same directorate as the chief economist's office, who does the who has teams who review our major business cases in investment. And so now by doing that and sort of aligning agendas, there's a question in there about what is the evidence behind the proposition that's in those business cases. Actually, we have a bit more capability to just join the dots and incentivize, and hopefully the word will get out that actually, if you do cite the right evidence, your business case will progress more quickly. And that's what people want to do. They want to get on to, just as you said, Stacey, they want to actually, achieve good, and you want your propositions to move through the system quickly. So I think the more that actually, the day-to-day work of trying to achieve good is, that we can get evidence and certainty, and actually if you get that right, or if you really know your evidence, you get rewarded by that on your annual review, or your business case move more quickly. Is those sorts of hardwiring, I think it'd be I think actions that are important, and we're trying methods. It might be an area also what would be really interesting to learn between us on what are the approaches that do really incentivize evidence use.
One wonderful recommendation. I think that in a sense it's part of the EAST model, right? You make things easy, accessible, and this one corresponds a bit to making it social. It's like it's easy to do, and everybody else does it, and it actually gets you more quickly. I mean, I think that's excellent point. So with that, we will now move to the Q&A session. We're a few minutes over, but that's okay because we've had such an amazingly inspiring discussion so far. And what I'll do is I'll read up the questions we have received from various people, and there's sort of 4 buckets. And then what I'll suggest is for each of you to take 1 or max 2 of these and address them succinctly as possible. So the first questions are related to NGOs and grassroots organizations. A couple of questions there that have come in. One from Oli Lucas. Please address how small organizations with grassroots operations can contribute to the development, review, and interpretation of data. And the other question came in from Shona Davidson from she's a grants and compliance specialist. What role can NGOs play in supporting institutions to strengthen evidence culture? Who are the key decision makers that influence these decisions, and how can we best support them as NGO implementers? So that's sort of one bucket. The second, there's some general institutional questions. Quite fascinating ones. How is the practical use of research evidence in your respective organization? Does research evidence dominate or the expert's opinion? So this came from Sabit Ababulgu. And then we have a second question here in this bucket. Given the increasing emphasis on knowledge by most development partners and the supposed translation of this knowledge into development solutions, why are we not getting more highly successful projects? So this came from John Whittle, an independent consultant. And then we got a question, how do you see the role of results-based financing in achieving greater impacts and improving outcomes? What are the challenges in contracting such projects from your agency's perspective? This is from Caroline Bernardi. Then there's a question related to technology, and this was particularly sort of directed to FCDO, but I think it's also relevant for others, so choose as you wish. The question was from Etisham Ul Hassan. What are the opportunities to use technology for evidence building and utilization? And finally, it relates a bit to the discussions we've had, and one of my favorite questions, and it relates to moral weights versus evidence. How does your agency determine the moral weights of different outcomes? For example, if you could expect to save 1 life, double the income of 7 households in extreme poverty, or treat 60 people for depression, which option should you choose and why? This was from Barry Grimes, Communications Manager at Happier Lives Institute. So there you got a wide variety, and I'll let you Who would like to go first? I don't want to, okay, Charlotte.
I'm happy to go first, as there was a question directed at me. So, I mean, so on the options of using technology, I mean, I think it really is exciting in terms of the opportunities technology give us. And I think, you know, and particularly for me, I think the sort of opportunities of digital, the opportunities of, you know, if you think about quantitative surveys, of collecting data much more rapidly, uploading it, you know, doing combined analysis, so just the ability, you can do that in far more efficiently nowadays than you could sort of 5 or 10 years ago. And I think that, you know, that kind of connectivity and sort of the ability to digitize data collection is one that gives us massive opportunities in evaluation processes. But to me, it's also the kind of complementary data that you can bring in as well. So, for example, more data about the context, and that might be data that you could get from satellite data or other sources of data. And then lastly, the opportunity in terms of thinking about collecting data, of also triangulation of data. And particularly for me, I think the importance of potentially being more able to rapidly bring in, for example, beneficiary experiences of programs, of understanding, you know, what might be, you might learn from social media or other sources of informal sources of data as well. I think give you the potential for far greater richness of understanding of what programs are doing, or what are the contextual factors that have influenced potentially success or challenges around a program. I think the second aspect is around accessibility. And for me, I think there's an element of, the obvious stuff around, ideally now with cloud systems, it should be much easier, and good search engines, it should be much easier just to be able to access synthesized data wherever you are sitting in the world. And particularly for us all with sort of global networks of staff, that sort of global accessibility is really important. But I think the other element for me is also that ability to engage. So to have L&D activities or communities of practice, we've all now really used to working like this, right? On a screen, but able to interact with colleagues all over the world. And so for me, the other element that is exciting around technology is that we can now have those conversations of people who are working on similar areas in different contexts or struggling with the same issues, to actually have a live conversation and learn from each other. And I think it goes to Stacey's point about actually that's the way you learn often, is through that interaction, hearing stories, that participatory dialogue is the stuff that really sort of sinks in and helps you then think about what does that breadth of different types of evidence mean for then what you do next.
Great, thank you. And then what I'll do now is there's a couple of live questions that have come in, particularly directed, I'm seeing a few for you, Alison. So I'll just throw in a couple of those, and then you can choose if you just answer those or want to add to the other questions or responding to them. So one was a follow-up. What formats to communicate evidence proved to be the most accessible and practical for decision makers on what you had presented? And similarly, I'm curious. This is the first one was from Maria Paola De Salvo, and then the other one from Rafael Bizio. I'm curious about the evaluation insight format you mentioned. How was it developed? What does it look like? And does it work to enhance the use of evidence? So just adding those to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks for the questions, everyone. I'll just reflect on a couple that you mentioned earlier, and then I'll try and touch on those too. The point about NGOs, grassroots organizations, and so on, I think is a really interesting one. And I mean, I suppose my thought there is about the importance of kind of building evidence partnerships, that it's not the case that every single entity, particularly those that are small, can build up these big edifices, if you like, of an evidence culture, but they can partner with others, and they can build out the ecosystem, I think, within countries, even at subnational level, where evidence is shared, evidence use is encouraged. And I just want to, give a plug that this is partly the spirit behind our global evaluation initiative, looking to support the building of national monitoring and evaluation capabilities at national and subnational level. That the idea that one invests in sort of systems of evidence generation use, and it can include not only public authorities, but also NGOs and grassroots organizations. So that's just a quick plug on that. I think I just want to reflect on that point about why aren't there any more successful projects? And I'm going to challenge that. I think actually, the evidence that we have certainly on the World Bank side is that there's a lot actually that is successful and is making a real difference. And from my time at ICAI in the UK, I would say exactly the same too. That we have a lot of evidence of things working and working well. But I do want to reflect on Charlotte's point about scaling. And I do think that's kind of where we're all at now, which is, I think we've learned very well, and evidence has helped us enormously to understand how to do the right things, but whether we're always doing the right thing in the right context to achieve the kind of scale effects that we really are looking to achieve, I think that is something that we're all still very much working on. So we've got lots of evidence of projects working, maybe at the margin. We need more evidence of what is actually transformative. So that would be my answer on that. And I think finally on particularly the evaluation insight note I mentioned, our first crop will be coming off the press in the next few months. We've basically these will be disclosed, but they're really oriented towards trying to address a number of gaps in our evaluation knowledge that we can mine our existing evidence to try and address. They're more operationally focused. They draw on a range of, if you like, synthetic methodologies, from more sort of structured and systematic review through to machine learning type techniques to get us to systematic qualitative data analysis and other things. We will be putting more out about these EINs over the coming period, but we need the first crop to really come to fruition. So watch this space and we'll keep everyone informed about that. Back to you, Marie.
Great, wonderful. Let me move straight on, because there's also one question which I'll add into I'll go to you next, Håvard, and I'll add one question from Graham Lepage. Which is, are there situations in which you think that an RCT is an inappropriate tool? So you can add that to your mix.
I guess, to some extent, that's an easy question to answer, right? It's definitely, obviously, clearly there's times and places where an RCT is absolutely not appropriate, and sometimes, well, even more often, it's not smart. Sometimes there's much better to use other tools. But I think, not to make light of the question, I think it's an extremely important question, because so impact evaluations, RCTs, has, for very good reasons, has become the gold standard for evaluation in a lot of development work. And that move to proper impact evaluations, to proper RCTs, was, I think, extremely important. And then there's always the worry, right, and the possibility that we're overshooting and doing too much of a good thing. And there's definitely some tendencies somewhere where RCTs are crowding out other good work, or basically that we're getting in a situation where it's the old joke of looking for the keys under the light instead of where they actually are, right? So RCTs is an extremely good tool for what they are meant to be used for, but sometimes we have to use other tools to get good traction and good evidence on other issues. And the fact that these other tools aren't proper RCTs or aren't proper impact evaluations shouldn't be used to detract from them, right? If you have good subnational geographically and located data, then you can do a lot with geographic matching, difference and difference. Not to get too technical, but some of these techniques can give you a lot of traction on causality without being proper RCTs. And sometimes remote sensing, as Charlotte touched on, can be an extremely powerful tool for getting outcome level information that we really need without it being properly identified or causal. So I think what I hope and what I really see, I think I see happening now is that we're moving to a phase where RCTs are more, they're getting their proper place in the hierarchy. So people are more and more using them. There's still some resistance some places, but that has more or less been wiped away. So now it's more a question of how do we use it most effectively? And we should use it where it's most effective, and we should use other tools where other tools are most effective.
Great, clear clarification. And then let me add one question to you, Stacey, and you can choose between answering that, but also adding. I thought it was an interesting one from Adeline Sibanda. Most of the institutions you represent here on the panel work with governments. How do you get governments use the evaluative evidence that you generate? What role does context culture play in the use of evaluative evidence?
Thanks, Marie, for that question. If I may, I would like to actually answer the question that came through the chat, specifically about how to measure how staff has applied evidence, because this is a question that we all get. So I would like to just say a few words about that. We've done a lot of this at USAID, and we have on an external website, USAIDlearninglab.org, we have a section specifically on evidence, how the evidence base that we have developed around how we know how collaborating, learning, and adapting, which is our program cycle learning approach, makes a difference both in terms of organizational effectiveness and in terms of development outcomes. In addition, there's been, as I mentioned earlier, an investment in understanding that team-based holistic learning approach and what has worked there. So just a few of the methods that we've used. We've conducted literature reviews of evidence from a number of disciplines around elements of these learning approaches so that we could match what is coming through other evidence building activities to the activities that we're doing, so that we can infer a corresponding impact. So that's one approach. Obviously, key informant interviews with people who have participated in learning activities is a source of a certain type of evidence. Using tools like a cultural analysis tool in the missions that our field offices that have undertaken these team-based learning events has been a way to understand shifts in the culture around evidence use. Doing network analysis to understand how information and knowledge is spreading through a network gets at least some of that diffusion. Doing deep dive analyses of cases that have come to us through the case competition to further piece together through outcome mapping and outcome harvesting methods what the contributions have been. There are others as well, but I'll leave it there and direct people to that the evidence-based section of USAIDlearninglab.org. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. So, okay, Charlotte, you have very quick one. We've got a half hour now.
Don't mind, yeah. I wouldn't mind just coming in again on that question on RCTs, because I think it's exactly right. It's one of the tools in the toolbox. It's a very powerful one. And I think the important thing for people who say, well, we can't do an RCT, the value of RCTs is we can say, actually, we know this wasn't due to some temporal effect, and it was, it wouldn't have just happened everywhere, or there isn't some sort of unknown confounding that led to this result. So I think when we're doing evaluations that aren't, because we have that comparison group, because we have the randomization. So I'm very happy to, I've done RCTs on mobilization interventions and sort of areas where people wouldn't think you could do an RCT. And I've seen how powerful it is, because you can say this is the size of the effect. That is incredibly powerful. I don't believe we can use RCTs for everything, but I do think in any evaluation that we do, we have to be able to answer the question of, would it have happened anyway? Is there some temporal effect, or is there something that's just confounding that's led to us thinking that there's an effect? So I think you've got to be aware of, actually, these are essentially why we're using it. It's not using it for the sake of it. We're using it because it enables us to answer those questions, and that's what you need to embed in any other evaluation, is how will you answer those questions. And then I just thought I'd pick up on the results-based financing, if it's okay, because I think it's a really important and interesting area, but it's complex. So at one level, with results-based financing, it does focus on the outcomes, which we know is really, really important. And it doesn't prescribe to, actually, we know what the pathway is to that. In a way, it gives an opportunity for community groups or groups who really work very closely to say, actually, we think we can deliver this, and in a way, and empower communities to do that, and to get finance if they do deliver. I think the challenges are around, actually, how do you set up the finance well? You need, what is the upfront resource you might need to actually implement an intervention versus what gets paid at the end, if the effects are achieved. I think there's just issue of what is the reasonable as the size of effect to expect in relation to the financing that's given. And then lastly, there's an issue of attribution. How do you really say, actually, this was an effect achieved because of that intervention? And so I think it's an area where we need evaluation research about results-based financing and the mechanisms underlying how we try and implement those.
Great. Thank you for this amazing panel, also for sort of being able to answer quite a lot of questions thrown at you, and also some online that have come through. So it's time to wrap up. Unfortunately, I have to say, I could have continued, listening to all of you for much more longer, and also sense, there's a lot of engagement in the audience. And so that's just, and I've learned a lot. That's just great. A lot of thoughts have been seem to be going into this issue of evidence culture now, and also I think what we've been hearing, and many promising approaches that have been mentioned that are being tried out. So I have to tell you that I'm leaving this panel more hopeful than I was before going into it, which and I hope that goes for others as well, and that we as a joint community can also help push the needle further on this. In 3IE, we will be engaging you over the coming months and probably years, and to help identify and share such promising approaches, help you all in this panel and beyond to share what you're learning. And so I'm sure we'll get back to you latest in a year from now. I hope that's okay. But in the meantime, we will have things on social media. There will be a blog where we will also try to capture, some important questions that we may not have had time to respond to. So stay tuned. Thank you so much for this amazing panel. Thanks for being a great audience, and have a good weekend and coming Easter. Thank you very much.